Truth.
You ever wonder how billions can disappear and nobody says a word? Not in a robbery, not in a war, just gone. What if that money, say, $60 billion, was taken from your country over years under the table and you didn't even know? And what if the proof sat not in a courtroom, not in a news report, but in the bottom drawer of a retired schoolteacher's desk? Not much to look at, just a yellow folder. But it held enough to crack open 3 decades of lies. This isn't fiction, this happened. In Burkina Faso, a country most folks in the West don't think about, one woman, one folder, one president who walked into the wrong room and said the one thing no one expected: "We're taking it back." Well, if you've ever felt like things were signed without your say, you're not crazy, and if this story's already got your gut turning, hit like not for the algorithm, but so it stays in your memory. Because what comes next, it only gets deeper. You ever notice how the biggest crimes don't happen in alleyways? They happen in boardrooms, no ski masks, no getaways, just men in suits smiling, shaking hands. While entire countries bleed out quietly, that's what happened here. Foreign companies, mining giants based in Europe, Canada, even the US came into Burkina Faso with something simple: contracts. Not weapons, not bribes in brown envelopes, just legal documents. Drafted in polished law firms, signed in air-conditioned rooms. And on paper, everything looked clean: neat margins, fancy stamps, multiple pages of legal jargon most villagers couldn't even read. But behind the paragraphs was a setup, a deal that said, "We take your gold, you get 2% forever." That's it, no end date, no scale clause, just 2%. For context, the standard royalty in the US for natural resources, even with lobbying, is around 12 to 18%. So imagine your house being rented out for $10,000 a month, and the landlord only gives you $200. And they never stop collecting, except this wasn't rent, it was national wealth. And the guy who signed that deal, he was indicted for embezzlement before the ink even dried. But the deal stayed for 30 years. You might be thinking, how is that even allowed? Let's be honest here. It's not that different from how some systems work here too, is it? How many times have we seen it? Some law passed at midnight, some tax loophole buried deep in 300 pages of bill text no one reads but everyone signs. Most people don't even know what's being traded in their name. And when the money vanishes, there's no villain in a mask, just silence. That's what makes it so effective. If that sounds familiar, if you've ever felt like you didn't get a say in decisions that shaped your future, hit like so you know you're not alone. And if the 2% deal made your blood boil just a little, drop 2% in the comments. Let's call it what it is: legal theft, but here's where it shifts. Because for once, someone wasn't afraid to call it TH. A woman from a village, and a president who wasn't on the invite list, but walked into the room anyway. The conference was exactly what you'd expect: 5-star hotel, polished suits, name tags, handshakes, wine glasses. The Western delegation had flown in: CEOs, diplomats, lawyers. Not a single shovel between them, but plenty of paperwork claiming ownership of what lay underground. Then something happened that wasn't on the schedule. The front doors opened. No announcement, no security detail. Just a man in a red beret and a woman in a wax print wrap holding a yellow folder tight to her chest. Nobody clapped, nobody smiled, because they knew who it was: President Ibrahim Traoré, young, calm, focused. Not the kind of calm that comes from PR training. The kind that comes from knowing you're not asking anymore. He stepped to the center of the room. One executive tried to shut it down. "This is a private meeting." Traoré didn't blink. "This is my country." And then he turned to the woman beside him. She held up the folder. Inside was one page. One word across the top in bold red letters, REVOKAD. The room froze. You could hear camera shutters. You could feel that gut instinct in the suits. This guy's not bluffing, one CEO muttered. You can't just cancel 30 years of investment overnight. Traoré stepped forward, voice low, steady. You call it investment. I call it theft. And it wasn't a performance. No media circus. No slogan, just fact. You could almost hear the old rules breaking, the kind of moment we don't see enough of. When someone finally speaks without spin. Look, we've seen politicians read scripts. We've seen boardrooms dodge accountability. But when a man walks into a room full of power and speaks like he doesn't need permission, that's different, that's the shift. If you've ever sat through a meeting thinking, why isn't anyone saying the thing that needs to be said? Then maybe this story is for you. Tap subscribe, not for motivation, just to stay close to stories where the silence breaks. But here's the thing, taking a stand is one thing. Turning that stand into a legal war. Now that takes a whole different kind of resolve. After that moment, you'd think the world would pause, maybe even listen. But power doesn't go quiet, it regroups. Within days, the threats rolled in. You're jeopardizing investment. You're violating trade agreements. You'll collapse your own economy. IMF issued a concerned advisory. European news outlets, who had never once run a story on Burkina Faso, suddenly had headlines like, "Authoritarian shift in West Africa." It's because apparently when you stop giving away your gold, you're unstable. Emails flooded the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They didn't scream, they whispered, urgent clarification needed. Diplomatic concern, potential funding freeze. A classic moves wrap a threat in polite language. Call theft a misunderstanding. And pray the other side folds, but they didn't fold. Traoré brought together a war room not with guns. With documents, a judge, a military officer, an economic analyst, that's who he trusted. They reviewed every mining contract since 1985, every loophole, every forged signature, some deals. They were built on colonial-era laws, literally copy-pasted. You ever look at something and realize it was never meant to serve you in the first place? That's what these contracts were. Legal cages, clean on the outside, rusted through inside. But here's where it gets real. They didn't stop at outrage, they got to work. If you've ever felt overwhelmed, like the system was just too complex to fight, this part's for you. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is read the fine print. Hit share if you know someone who's tired of being told it's too late to change anything. It's not. But while they were mapping fraud and tracing money, one quiet visit from a former border guard changed everything. They're not just moving gold, he said, they're moving kids. They thought they'd found the worst of it, billions siphoned, forged contracts, tax havens across 3 continents. But then came a tip. A man from the border, shaky voice, said he'd seen trucks marked with fake NGO logos. Said there were children, said something didn't feel right, so they followed the road. No fanfare, no sirens, just a plainclothes team led by Captain Humor. And 5 kilometers past where the map stopped, they found it, a walled compound with a painted sign. Children's Protection Center. Official on paper, empty in real life. Inside were rows of bunk beds, small sandals lined up neatly under frames like the kids had just stepped out, but they hadn't. The main storeroom didn't hold food or clothes. It held gold, bagged, tagged, ready for export. Underneath the humanitarian label was a smuggling route, and behind the smiling charity website, forced child labor. They even found a handwritten notebook, first names only. Ages 6 to 9, no records, no family contacts, just ghosts. And suddenly this wasn't about policy anymore, it was personal. Humor dropped to one knee in that dusty room and whispered, "This isn't theft, it's desecration." Back in the capital, the president didn't wait. They went public. They showed the images. The compound, the crates, the names. The silence was immediate and furious. Parents gathered in village squares. Teachers stopped class to explain what exploitation really looked like. The public knew one thing for sure: this had gone too far. If this part hit something in you, don't scroll, don't shrug, comment with one word: enough. That's how the fight started over there. Maybe it's how it starts over here too. The gold kept moving by air, by truck, by silence. Until one night the planes came home. You'd think the return of stolen gold would come with cameras, red carpets, a press conference. But it didn't. It came with silence. Midnight, on a fogged runway, 12 cargo planes, no markings, no announcements. Just a low hum over Ouagadougou. The crates were stamped with the insignia of Swiss and Emirati banks. Inside, gold bars, real, raw, heavy with the weight of 3 decades of lies finally breaking. Soldiers moved them quietly. No crowd control, no ceremony, but people showed up anyway. Word had spread not through media but whispers. Farmers, teachers, elders gathered in the hills near the airstrip, some barefoot, some holding candles. They didn't come to cheer. They came to witness. A child pointed at one of the planes and asked his grandmother, "Is that really ours?" She didn't look away, she just said, "It always was." Nearby stood Aïcha Dembel, no speech, no stage. Just her and the folder she once carried in a leather bag on a bus ride that changed a country. She didn't cry loud. Just tears steady, falling into the dust like something sacred was finally returning to the soil. And here's the thing: this wasn't about wealth. It wasn't even about justice. It was about memory. Because when something's been taken from you long enough, you stop believing it ever belonged to you, until the day it comes back, slowly, quietly. But undeniably. If you've ever had something taken from your family, your people, your future, and no one ever said sorry, this part's for you. Hit like if this moment sat heavy in your chest. And share it if you think someone needs to remember what return looks like. But gold wasn't the only thing returning. Something else came back that night, something harder to define. A sense that maybe, just maybe, they could decide what justice meant for themselves. The real trial didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a village square. Sapon, no suits, no gavels, just a raised platform made from old schoolhouse planks and children in oversized black robes made of bedsheets. They called it a tribunal, but it wasn't make-believe. It was memory turned into ritual. This wasn't about punishment. This was about naming what had never been said out loud. One by one, the kids stood up, not reading scripts. Reading testimonies, real words from real villagers. They said they'd bring schools, but all they left were holes in the ground. My uncle worked 6 years, no contract, no pension, no name in their books. They promised roads and gave us silence. The chalkboard behind them listed the crimes: stolen gold, poisoned rivers, burned trees, broken backs, broken promises. And then they called for Aïcha. She stood slowly. No podium. No microphone, just presence. She looked around, not at the stage, but at the faces. Kids she once taught, mothers who once sat in her class, boys who once ran through her garden barefoot. And she said, "We taught them math. And they used it to count what they stole. We taught them language, and they used it to silence us with paper instead of chains." She wasn't angry, just tired and clear. But that time is over, because now we count ourselves. We write our names, we dig not for gold but for truth. The children raised both hands. One hand declared, "The land is guilty of silence." The other, "The people are innocent and rising." There were no fireworks, no anthem. Just quiet applause that felt like something deeper, like a wound had finally been named. Back in the capital, President Traoré received a photo from the event. Aïcha standing among the kids, one hand on a boy's shoulder, the other raised in quiet defiance. He placed it on his desk beside the recovered gold ledger and said to no one in particular, "This is the verdict that matters." If this part made you sit still for a moment, don't rush past it. We don't always get this kind of justice. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but when it shows up in a village, in a child's voice, in a truth finally spoken, we feel it. Drop a candle if this moment stayed with you. And share it if you think someone needs to believe in quiet power again. But naming the wound was just the start. They weren't finished. They were rewriting the rules themselves, this time with their own pen. The gold came back, but it wasn't enough. Because even when you recover what was stolen, there's still a question hanging in the air. How do we make sure they don't take it again? That's when they did something few countries have ever done. They rewrote their constitution. Article 27A, a new amendment, handwritten first, debated in open-air meetings. Not behind closed doors, but in village schools, marketplaces, farm co-ops. The language wasn't written for lawyers. It was written for people. And when the time came, President Traoré didn't sign it in a marble hall. He stood in front of a long wooden table, surrounded by teachers, miners, elders, and students. He took the pen and signed his name to words that had been centuries in the making. From this day forward, all natural resources beneath our soil belong to the people, not the presidency, not foreign companies, not donors, the people. There was no explosion of applause, just silence. Like the land itself was listening, outside the palace, villagers gathered not in protest but in witness. They called it Stone Day, not a holiday, a recognition. In Sapon, a granite slab was delivered by truck. No bronze plaque, no marble statue, just one line etched deep into red stone: "We are the soil and the soil remembers." Aisha was there, she didn't speak. Just pressed her hand against the stone, letting her fingers trace the words like a prayer. A little girl beside her asked what it meant. Her mother said, "It means everything we lost is coming back." Back in the capital, copies of the amendment weren't locked away. They were printed and handed out to schools, unions, marketplaces. Traoré sent the original not to a lawyer, but to a rural school, with a note: "Let the children read what we never could." And that's what made it different. They didn't just nationalize resources, they spiritualized them. They didn't just reclaim what was stolen. They declared, in plain language, that ownership without dignity isn't ownership at all. And here's the part that matters: they didn't need the world's permission to do it. They just needed to remember that the land didn't forget them. We don't often see power given back, not really. If this moment meant something to you, leave a in the comments. Let's mark it the way they did, quietly but permanently. And if you're tired of seeing what's ours handed over in silence, share this. Let's start writing some new contracts, ones we actually believe in. And then they built a museum, not for tourists, not for gold, for memory, for proof that silence, once broken, could echo for generations. It didn't look like much, just a yellow folder, worn edges, no gold trim, no velvet rope. Just a glass case set in the center of a room with clay-red walls, the same color as the earth in Sapon. They called it the Museum of Dignity. No corporate sponsors, no foreign donors, every brick paid for by villagers, teachers, street vendors, students. There were no giant screens, no QR codes, just light, natural, soft. And in that center case lay the folder Aisha Dembele had carried from her brother's house to the president's desk. It hadn't been rewritten. It hadn't been polished. Inside were the same maps, same notes, same handwriting that proved $60 billion had been stolen, and that someone had dared to track every ounce of it. People didn't rush through the room, they moved slowly, like they were walking through something sacred. A teacher held her student's hand and whispered, "That's the folder that brought our gold home." On the walls, you could see photos of miners who never came back, a ledger showing gold shipments labeled as medical aid. A replica of the stone from Sapon carved with the line, "We are the soil and the soil remembers." In the corner, a screen played footage of the night the gold returned. No narrator, just engines humming, villagers watching from hilltops, soldiers standing still. At one point, a boy stood next to Aisha and asked, "Did your brother know this would happen?" She didn't look at him, just at the folder. "He didn't know if it would work," she said. "He just knew it had to be done." And maybe that's what courage really is, not certainty, just conviction. Later that day, President Traoré came by with a few of his advisors. No press, no speeches. He looked at the case at the folder at Aisha and placed his hand on the glass beside hers. For a long time no one spoke. Then Judge Aminata said, "She carried our Constitution before it was ever written." And Captain Humor added, "She carried the truth like it was a child." You know, we live in a world where museums are often about conquest. What we took, what we owned, what we defeated, but this one was different. This one was about what was returned, what was remembered, what was finally written down in their own words. If you've ever wished your family's story was told in a room like this, not forgotten, not rewritten, just seen, then maybe this folder means something to you too. Leave a comment, or just a name, someone you think deserved better. And if this part stayed with you, hit subscribe. Because this story isn't rare, it's just rarely told. By the time the museum opened its doors, there were no VIP guests, just kids barefoot, in uniforms sewn by hand. Walking slowly not to see history as entertainment, but as something that finally belonged to them.